I was, by every account that mattered to me at the time, a man accustomed to silence. Not the gentle kind, not the comfortable quiet of a well-run house or the hush of a library at midnight. I mean the silence of compliance, the silence of tenants who received my letters and folded. The silence of solicitors who knew better than to argue. The silence of a county that had watched my father and his father before him and understood, in the deep and wordless way that counties understand such things, that a letter from Caldvere Hall was not an invitation to correspond. It was a door closing. That is the silence I had always received. And then I wrote to Miss Orla Crane of Hartwell Parsonage about the disputed right of way along the south boundary of her father's glebe-land. She wrote back, 7 pages. I want to be precise about this, because in the years that followed I would be tempted to remember it fondly, to soften the shock of it into something charming. It was not charming. I sat in my study at Caldvere Hall on a gray October morning, opened what I assumed would be a brief letter of capitulation, and unfolded instead 7 pages of the most composed, methodical, and utterly devastating legal argument I had read since my time at university. She cited 3 property surveys. She had located, somewhere, the original enclosure minutes from 1764. She pointed out, in language precise enough to have been written by my own solicitor, that the right-of-way in question had been walked and maintained by the residents of Hartwell Parsonage for 63 years, which under common law constituted an easement by prescription and rendered my claim not merely contestable, but, in her word, she actually used the word, frivolous, at the bottom of the 7th page in a hand that did not waver. I trust this concludes the matter. Miss Orla Crane. I read it twice. Then I called for my horse. The Hartwell road was 3 miles of rutted chalk and browning hedgerow, and I rode it in a temper I was not entirely proud of. I had formed a picture of Miss Crane on the basis of her letter. Sharp-tongued, probably young enough to be reckless, probably buoyed by some solicitor father or well-read brother who had drafted the argument and handed it to her to copy. I intended to make this clear to her, politely, but clearly. The parsonage was smaller than I expected. It sat low in the lane, the garden still tidy despite the season, a smoke thread from one chimney. A maid answered the door and looked at me with the frank alarm that my arrivals tended to produce, and I asked for Miss Crane. What I had not accounted for was the room. She received me in a small study that smelled of paper and tallow and the particular dry warmth of a fire kept burning for a sick room rather than a sitting room. The door to the adjoining room stood ajar, and through it I could see a narrow bed, an older man asleep in it, and the careful arrangement of medicines on a side table that spoke of long and practiced attendance. Miss Crane herself sat behind a writing desk that was covered, entirely covered, in papers, ledgers, 2 open volumes, and a half-finished letter. She rose when I entered. She was not what I had expected. I could catalogue what I saw, but the truer thing is this. She looked at me without flinching. Not with hostility, not with the particular social courage of someone performing confidence they do not feel. She looked at me the way a person looks at a problem they have already solved and are mildly surprised to see standing in their study uninvited. "Your Grace," she said, "I did not know you made personal calls." "I do," I said, "when the correspondence becomes sufficiently extraordinary. Then you must receive a great deal of extraordinary correspondence." I had not come to be outmaneuvered in the first 30 seconds. I pulled out the letter. "Miss Crane, you have cited a survey from 1764 that I was not aware existed." "Yes." "Where did you find it?" "The county archive. It is open to the public on Wednesdays." A pause, measured, precise, not unkind. I went on a Wednesday. From the adjoining room came the soft sound of her father shifting in his sleep. She glanced toward the door, and the movement was so automatic and so unguarded, a fraction of a second, then back to me, that it told me more than an hour of conversation could have. She had been managing this, the parsonage, the papers, the sick room, the letters from Caldvere Hall, that must have felt, to a woman in her position, like yet another weight pressed against her chest. And she had written back 7 pages. I looked at the survey in my hands. Then I looked at her. "The matter," I said, "requires further review." It was not a surrender. I told myself it was not a surrender. I rode back to Caldvere Hall and wrote to my solicitor. My solicitor confirmed, by the following Thursday, that Miss Crane was entirely correct. The easement by prescription was airtight. The right-of-way was not mine to claim. I wrote to Miss Crane to inform her of this conclusion. Her reply arrived 2 days later, a single paragraph. She thanked me for my prompt attention to the matter, noted that she hoped we might consider the dispute resolved, and expressed the polite hope. She was always precisely polite, I came to understand, in exact proportion to how thoroughly she had just won something. That the autumn had not found Caldvere Hall inconvenienced by the review. I wrote back, I do not know exactly what possessed me. The letter began as a professional acknowledgement, and became, by the third paragraph, a question. Had she always maintained the parsonage records, or was that a more recent arrangement? I was aware, as I sealed it, that this was not the sort of question a Duke of Caldvere needed answered. I sent it anyway, she replied. Her father had been ill for 2 years. She had taken over his correspondence, his parish records, his household accounts, and the management of the small lending library he kept for the village, because there was no one else to do it. She wrote this without self-pity. She wrote it the way you state a fact about the weather. I wrote back again. What happened over the next 6 weeks is, in retrospect, the finest education I have ever received. Miss Crane wrote about the books she was cataloging. I wrote about the estate records I was reviewing. My father had left Caldvere in a state of deliberate obfuscation, and the untangling of it was slow work. She had opinions about record-keeping that were better than my steward's. I found myself looking forward to the post in a way I had not looked forward to anything in recent memory. And somewhere in the 5th week, I caught myself reading one of her letters twice, not for the information, but for the particular quality of her sentences, which had a brisk, undecorated precision that managed despite itself to be warm. I wrote back to Hartwell. I told myself this time that it was to discuss the drainage question she had raised in her most recent letter. A legitimate concern about the boundary ditch that I had an obligation to address. I told myself this all the way up the parsonage lane. I told myself it with the particular conviction of a man who has not yet admitted what he is doing, which is to say, with great force and no credibility at all. Her father was better. He was sitting up, a blanket across his knees, and when the maid showed me into the study, Miss Crane was reading to him through the open door. She stopped when she saw me, rose, and came to meet me with an expression that was, for the first time, not entirely composed. You came again, she said. The drainage matter. I mentioned the drainage matter in a postscript. It seemed urgent. She looked at me for a moment. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile. Not quite, but something adjacent to it. Something that knew. My father would like to thank you, she said. He was awake when your letter arrived, the one in which you acknowledged the easement. He asked me to read it to him. He was pleased. I had not considered that the letter would be read aloud. I had not considered, in truth, that there was an ailing father in that bed, for whom the outcome of this dispute meant the security of the only home he had ever kept. I had thought of it as a legal question. I sat with them for an hour. The Reverend Crane was a quiet man, precise-minded and dry, with the same unhurried patience in his speech that I recognized from his daughter's letters. We talked about the county archive. We talked about the enclosure records. We talked about the drainage. By the time I rose to leave, I was aware, in the way that you become aware of things you have been refusing to look at directly, that I had not wanted the drainage question resolved at all. I wanted an excuse to come back. I came back the following week, then the week after. The letters continued. They ran alongside the visits now, the two of them twined together, and I understood that the correspondence had become something I had no decent name for and no wish to end. She challenged everything I said, not combatively, but with the particular quality of a mind that has been working hard in solitude for a long time and has things to say. She was interested in ideas, the way some people are interested in other people, and she was interested in other people too. Her questions about Caldvere, about its people and its history, were not polite inquiries. She wanted to know. By December I had stopped pretending the visits had anything to do with the boundary. Her father knew, I think, from fairly early on. He was a man who had watched parishioners for 40 years and understood what people concealed from themselves better than they did. He never said anything. He simply, on my 4th or 5th visit, left us alone in the study for longer and longer periods, and once, catching my eye as he retired, gave me the faintest nod, the kind that means, yes, and you may. It was a January evening, the fire low, a candle on the desk between us, when I finally stopped circling. She was writing, always writing. There was always something that needed writing. And I was supposed to be reviewing a page of estate accounts. She had very efficiently reorganized, without being asked. I looked at the accounts. I looked at her. She had a small ink stain on her left forefinger that she had not noticed, and her hair was coming loose from its pin. And she was frowning slightly at whatever she was writing in the way. She frowned at arguments she found insufficient. I said, Miss Crane. She did not look up immediately. She finished her sentence. Then, yes, Your Grace, I would like to ask you a question. Now she looked up. She set her pen down with a precision that told me she already knew this was not about the accounts. I would like, I said, to keep writing to you, and visiting, and listening to you dismantle every assumption I arrive with. I would like to do this, permanently if you are willing, as your husband. The room was very quiet. She looked at me for a long time. Not the look she gave problems she had already solved. Something different. Something that had been waiting, I thought, to be certain it was real before it let itself be glad. You are asking me to marry you, she said. I am. In the same room where I informed you that your land claim was frivolous. I thought it a fitting location. A pause. That not quite smile. Then, are you going to put it in writing? I looked at her. She looked at me, and then she smiled. Fully, the first time I had seen it unguarded, and it was the finest thing I had ever seen in this or any other room. I took a sheet of paper from the desk. I wrote 4 sentences. I signed it, folded it, and slid it across the desk to her. She read it. She looked up. It cites no legal precedent, she said. I thought it could stand without one. She looked at the letter again. Her hand came to rest on it. That same still, careful hand that had written 7 pages to a duke who had never expected to be answered. Yes, she said, that was all, that one word. Quiet and sure, in the small room that smelled of paper and tallow, with the fire low and the candle burning between us. And it was more than enough. It was, in 33 years of living, the first time I had written something and truly hoped for a reply. She gave me one. She gives me one still, every day, across the breakfast table at Caldvere Hall, brisk and precise and warm, never a word wasted, always exactly what I need to hear. I remain, as I have been from the morning she sent back 7 pages, entirely answered.